of going along with catching the conquering spirit, Joshua chapter 8 says, in verse 26 or 28 through 31 says, so Joshua burned Ai. So this is basically talking about, this was last week, right? They defeated Ai, right? They burned the city. They destroyed everything, correct? And then verse 30 says, then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel. And so it talks about, once again, them setting up altars, right? And we've talked about this quite a bit throughout this series, but it's all about building altars and memorials, right? And so one of the things God reminded me of is our return to the memorials, or remembering God. And so what I wanted to do is then take us back a little bit in this journey of the children of Israel, okay? And look at the whole book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Not that we're going to read the whole thing. But let's just look at this for a second. So this whole journey begins out in giving them the promised land that they have to first escape Egypt, correct? And so God in Exodus chapter 7 through 13 brings about the plagues upon Egypt, so that the Pharaoh will let his people go to be able to worship him, and then they can go and inherit the promised land that has been called to them. And then, if you'll notice, throughout all this thing and all this happens, the children of Israel have a ceremony of the firstborn, which is basically they dedicate their firstborn to God. And so what is that? That is a memorial. It's a memory. It's an altar. It's a reminder of what God accomplished for them, right? And then we look at Exodus 14 through 15. It talks about the parting of the Red Sea. And then guess what? What do? They write a song about it. They have a song of celebration. And it talks about each one of them singing different verses of this song. And it was important to them. Why? Because this is another thing that God has done. Bitter waters at Marah become sweet, right? And so all these things are happening throughout this time period. In Exodus chapter 16, manna. They get manna. They get 2 quarts preserved and eventually placed in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, this is cool. I never really paid attention to this before, but before Tupperware was invented, God made it work, because they took 2 quarts of manna that should have gone bad pretty quick and kept it for a really long time. What was it, though? It was as a reminder to the people. And it was kind of cool because it was preserved. It really was, for a long period of time. And eventually it says it was placed in the Ark of the Covenant when the Ark of the Covenant was completed. And then in Exodus 17, what happens? They're thirsty. God tells Moses to hit a rock. He hits it and water flows out. That just doesn't occur. So these are amazing things throughout life that are happening. And God is telling them to remember. You know, he actually called upon them at certain times to actually remember. He said, make sure and do this when you get done, or make sure and do this as a memorial. And so he wanted them to be able to pay attention to what had happened. Because why? Because if we realize what God has done before and know what God is leading us to, we have complete faith that he will complete the task, right? And it's interesting because a lot of times God didn't lay out the whole plan for them, because they would have gotten confused. So he brings them piece by piece, step by step, and continues to provide for them in every possible way they might have need of. And so, now here's what's interesting, okay? Exodus 7 through 17, all these things that I've mentioned, took place over a period of probably about less than 2 months. So that's a lot of major things happening in a very short amount of time, right? And you're thinking like, wow, how could you forget? And I love it because Clara made it so prevalent in the statement that she made, that she said, Kelly, where she said that God gives us a new job, and then we're saying we have to work too much. Or God gives us this car, and then we have to, fill it up with gas and do all this, clean it, all these kind of things. And so it's interesting to look at this, because we can look at the children of Israel and say, I'd do better than that. maybe in some points having the knowledge that we have, but would we do it at the same point that they were doing it? And it's because they were crying out for things. So continuing on from there, Exodus chapter 19. Guess what happens? Do y'all remember? No, it's kind of hard to remember sometimes. Sinai, right? Which is what? Meeting place with God. And here's what's interesting, because if you look at this, God not only meets with the main leaders, he comes down and meets with everybody at this point. I mean, this is God, you know? And so once again, in fact, it continues on in Exodus chapter 20, where Moses has provided the 10 Commandments through this whole process. And then God instructs him on 3 festivals that they need to have to commemorate what has occurred. And then Moses comes down and builds an altar. Why? Because he does not want people to forget what has happened. In fact, I don't know how many of you have, but have you ever taken leisurely drives through the country and passed by like historical markers and stuff? Have y'all seen those? I've seen some of those, and they're pretty neat because you can drive by and all of a sudden you'll just see this thing out in the middle of the woods or whatever, and it's just to the side of the road, and you can go and read like, Pocahontas and John Smith had a kiss here or something. I don't know what it's telling you about, but it's interesting because you can see things that happened, and it reminds us a little bit of our history and where we came from, what we came out of, and hopefully that we won't go back to. If you continue on, Exodus chapter 34, Moses gets the second 10 Commandments. Because y'all know what happens the first time, right? He gets ticked off when he comes down the mountain like, you stinking people, and throws it down the ground, right? And it busts into pieces, and so then it has to be redone. And then Moses becomes, and I love this, so Moses Kim, who, just got the citizenship and everything like that, his real name is Kwayong Kim. Well, Kwayong means shining face. And so that's why I changed it to Moses. Well, this is funny because in Exodus 34, Moses becomes known as glowing face. Shining face, however you want to say it. And so it's very interesting how this occurs. And we're talking about somebody looking like a glow stick. Unnatural. And it doesn't go away immediately. It takes time to go away. Exodus 35 through 40, it talks about building the tabernacle and the ark and all these things completed, specifically to God's specifications. Why? Because it needed to be that way. Yes. Yeah, so it was basically kind of a way to not see him deluminate. Because otherwise they'd think differently of him at that point. And that is a valid case because, if things changed that dramatically and that drastically, it would affect a lot of people in a strange way. And also, I would think, if nothing else, I'd put a thing on my face just to hold on to it longer. Got a built-in nightlight. No. And it's very interesting because if you follow along the Word of God, each piece of the tabernacle, it describes it in detail. Like God gave, every little piece, like this much this much this. It has to be this tall, this wide, this color, this, everything's built to a specific thing. And then the ark is built. And what is that doing? That's carry around memorials. Because what does it do? It carries, so far we've heard that it carries the manna that was preserved from the time when they did that. It then later on carries the 10 Commandments, right? And so all these things are, once again, memorials, but this is a portable memorial carrier that they can take with them. Why? Because it showcases the presence of God, who he is, and what he can do. Now, is it important that the things are who they are? No. It's the power of God showcased through these moments in time. And then we go on to Leviticus. Okay, Leviticus is a unique book, but it, once again, is going over the rules, the procedures. The offerings have to be taken a certain way. The sacrifices made to God. All these different things had to be done just right because he didn't want anything that wasn't pure. He didn't want anything, you know what I'm saying? He wanted everything to be just right. It had to be just perfect. And so he gave them rules. And then Numbers 1 through 9 is then preparing the people of Israel to enter the promised land. So we've gone through 3 books of the Bible, and up till Numbers 10, and that's been about a total of 2 years. So in 2 years, all these things have occurred. All these promises they've traveled through these areas, you know what I'm saying? They've made progress. They've gotten up to this point. God has brought them through. In fact, I'm sure some of them probably made a little map showing what they had come through thus far and all the things that God had accomplished. And then some of it, they got to actually bring it with them because, once again, it was placed in the Ark of the Covenant. And this is where it gets a little interesting. In Numbers chapter 10, people began heading to the promised land, okay? So they're working their way to the promised land. And it's kind of interesting because you would think with that in sight that there would be a clear picture, there would be no concept of disillusion, that everything would be clear and visible to them. But in number 14, so basically what had happened is they had sent spies into the land to find out what happened. Of course, we know Joshua, who we've been talking about, right, and Caleb, both bring back a good report, but there's 10 people who bring back a really bad report. I mean, like, we're going to die, it's over, forget it. It's awesome, but we ain't getting close to it. And so what's interesting here is in Numbers 14, the people actually rebel. If you read this, it says, the whole community in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron said, if only we would have died in Egypt or even here in the wilderness. And they go on and complain. You know, it's like, what? Look what you've made it through thus far, you know? And they actually say, let's choose a leader and go back to Egypt. And so Joshua and Caleb said to all the people, they said, the land we traveled through and explored is a wonderful land, and if the Lord, I love this, if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. Do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. But they began to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb then. And so you see a picture here of people who are remembering what has been accomplished and remembering the courage and the just all-moving faith in a God that can change the direction of water, you know, that can cause things to happen that just don't happen. And so these were miraculous things, and the people just say, you know, whatever. And so then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tabernacle. And I'm wondering, you know, just exactly what this picture looks like. To me, I can only imagine like a swirling cloud almost. And God's kind of like, you know, kind of a thing. And the Lord said to Moses, I will disown them and destroy them with a plague, and then I'll make you into a nation greater and mightier than they are. So if you'll notice here, Moses and Aaron have about had it. You know, in fact, if you look throughout the different times in the Word of God, it talks about the fact that they at times, you know, just kind of fell on their faces, or they, you know, just didn't know what to do, or they cried out to God even at times and said, God, what do we do with these people? They're driving me crazy, you know? And then all of a sudden, and then, you know, Joshua and Caleb are about to get stoned for just bringing a good message. And their message was of faith. And so the Lord comes down and says, I'm just going to disown them and destroy them with a plague. I want to ask a question to you real quick. And this isn't your paper stuff, but it says, I will disown them and destroy them with a plague. Then I will make into you a nation greater and mightier than they are. Had things gone a little bit differently with Moses, what is something do you think that could happen? And I don't have an answer written here, so I'm not looking for a specific answer or whatever. But I'm just wondering, what do you think would have happened had Moses just said, okay, Because honestly, Moses could have. He could have said, "I'm fed up with them too. Take them, God." What do you think? How would that have changed things? I like that. So you're saying even though that the people were failing on their own, that Moses, as their leader, needed to continue to have the faith that the people could still fulfill the promise that God had given them, and that's valuable. Anybody else? Like I said, I'm just kind of asking because these are some interesting points that were like, if these people hadn't interjected themselves, what would have occurred? Does anybody else have an opinion or have a thought? Yeah. So you're basically saying it could have almost been like a Noah experience where they said, we're just going to start over with these few and we're going to go on from here. And that could have very well happened because you had Joshua, Caleb, who are strong people. You had Moses, you had Aaron. So and you had some others who would have followed them. And so it's interesting to think about that. That had Moses not made this next interjection for the people, what would have happened? So if you continue going on here in in the book of Moses, no, in the book of Numbers, chapter 14, we're looking still. If we look at verses 13 through 19. This is Moses interceding for the people. And it said, but Moses objected. What will the Egyptians think when they hear about this? He asked God. If you slaughter these people, they're going to say the Lord wasn't able to bring them into the land he swore to give them. So he killed them in the wilderness. He got fed up with them. Please, Lord, pardon the sins of my people, just as you've forgiven them ever since they left Egypt. I love how he said that. Ever since they left Egypt. Because it wasn't once forgiven. Because if you'll notice, there were tons of times when they made mistakes and had to come back to God and get cleaned up. He had to forgive them. They continued on, had to make a mistake, got clean. Kind of like we were talking about last week. And so it's interesting to look at that. And it says, the Lord said, I will pardon them as you have requested. But, and this is what I find very interesting. He says, not one of these people will ever enter that land. They have all seen my glorious presence and the miraculous signs I have performed both in Egypt and in the wilderness. But again and again they have tested me by refusing to listen to my voice. By my servant Caleb, who has remained loyal to me, so I will bring him into the land. His descendants will possess their share. Turn around. You must set out for the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea. This is an important part. This is super important. So basically, God's saying that I'm going to let part of you go in, but those who have been old enough to know what's going on and make decisions, you've made your decision, and you're going to suffer for it. But then I'm going to allow your children to go in. And so here's what's interesting. He sends them in the direction of the Red Sea. Now, what does that do? Huh? Remind them, right? It's a U-turn. They literally have to go back the same way they came. What do you think they're going to see along the way? The mistakes and the memorials where God was faithful. So if we continue on here, it's interesting because it says, then the Lord said, tell them this, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. And this is something that's important too because it talks about the value of what you say. You will all drop dead in this wilderness. Remember, they said we should have died in the wilderness. Because you complained against me, every one of you who is 20 years old or older and was included in the registration will die, except Caleb and Joshua. Your children will be like shepherds wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. In this way, they will pay for your faithfulness until the last of you lies dead. Because your men explored the land for 40 days, you're going to wander for 40 years. And in this way, they will pay for your faithlessness until the last of you lies dead. Oh, hold on. I went backwards. A year for each day, suffering the consequences of your sin. The 10 men who incited rebellion against the Lord with their bad report were struck dead with a plague before the Lord, like immediately. So the 10 people who fed the bad report ain't taking time with them. And then he says, and then here's what's interesting, okay? So God's laid this plan out, right? They're supposed to return to the Red Sea. Sorry, you messed up. You're going to have to go back. And so they go to bed. They wake up the next morning. Children of Israel go, we've realized that we sinned. Now we're ready to enter into the Lord's promise for us. And Moses is like, what? You're still going to disobey the Lord's orders to return to the wilderness? It won't work. And so stupidly, they tried it. Guess what happened? The Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in those hills came down and attacked them and chased them away, running with their tails between their legs, back the way they came. And so what's interesting here is, and this is some of the things we need to look at, but what we make verbal about our situations can sometimes lead us into those situations. So if you're verbalizing negative, you're going to walk into negative. If you're verbalizing the positive and the promises that God has, you're going to walk into those promises. If you notice, right, 12 spies were sent in. 12 spies saw the same exact thing. 10 spies saw death and destruction, and they received it. 2 spies saw victory and promise, and what? Received it. Okay? And so this is what's interesting. And so if we continue going on, it says that, and those things actually cursed them. They literally cursed themselves. I wish we'd have died in the desert. Fine, die in the desert. And so each one of these things happen. But here's what's very interesting. God says, I need you to turn around and go to the Red Sea. And here's what's interesting. I want you to go and follow the same steps that you followed before, because I want to personally have you remember what I have accomplished through you to bring you to this point. But sadly, because you have to go back and follow through all this, you'll never make it to the promise. Yeah. And yeah, because it's a legacy thing, right? It's the fact that, hopefully our kids will learn from our mistakes and continue on and go further. Right? And I hope that's what my kids do. Trust me, 100%. And I praise God every day that they don't make the same mistakes that I do. But here's the thing. We have to remember. And if we fail to remember the times God has saved us, then we might be sent back to the memorials of the times that He redeemed us, but never get to experience the promises. So we always want to make sure and do this. So there's 5 kind of things I want to look at. And you can number them 1 through 5, however you want to do it, on that piece of paper that you have. Whichever side's empty. Because if you wrote notes on one side, write it on the other side. But there's a couple of things that I just want you to answer. And I realize some of this is kind of hard to answer outside. Just vocalize it. And so I want you to hold on to these, because why? We're creating a memorial. Okay? This is something that I want you to hold. I want you to keep with you. Keep it in your purse. Keep it in your billfold. Keep it in your pocket. Whatever you want to do, keep it with you, because it's going to be a memorial. So number 1, do you want the promises? Now, this is probably going to be an easy one, because you're going to go, or whatever. Okay? What are those promises that God has given you? No, that's just one. Yeah. So, do you want the promises? You can just say yes or no. And then remember for just a second, what are some of those promises that God has given me? So you individually, what are some of the promises that God has made to you? And you at home can do the same thing. Do you want the promises? And if so, what are those promises that you're supposed to be, that you desire, that God has placed in your heart for you to go after with all that you are? And don't forget, God's with you along the way. But we have to desire the promise. Because the children of Israel wouldn't have just walked out in the desert not knowing they weren't going to something good, right? But they knew they were going to the promised land. And so you have to have something in sight. You have to have something to hold on to, something to look forward to. Now I'm going to ask a second question. Does anybody want to share? If you don't, I have no problem. I just wanted to ask. Salvation. Salvation for our families. Mm-hmm. I like that statement. Um, so Pastor Brian was saying that he believes that God has given him a promise of this church reaching multitudes. And actually, and he says he believes that to the fact of whether he's foolish or not, he's going to believe it with all of his heart. Interestingly enough, we were doing some research on some of the outlets we have put into for media and the YouTube, podcast, different things like that. We're actually reaching 4 different countries with our message, and we are reaching 400 and above fairly on a weekly basis. So, and that's more than can fit in here. So literally, if we had them all here, they would be standing on the outside. So I thought that was just kind of cool, and that may, and I don't feel like that's in all the completion of the promise, but I'm just saying it's interesting how those things are starting to showcase themselves in different ways. So good one. Secondly, do you need to return to your memorials? So that's the question. Secondly, do you need to return to your memorials? This is the points in our life when God has brought us through things that seemed like they were impossible. And it showcases the fact that God is faithful to complete what he says. Because I know a lot of times, well, just to share my own personal thing, I've always felt God compelling me into ministry. I feel very strongly about preaching the gospel, presenting his word, loving people, sharing with people however I can do that. And it doesn't always look like that's a thing happening for me directly. I'm trying to pick up little things here and there to make things work and stuff, and it doesn't seem like things are going right. But then I remember the times when God has stepped in and saved the day. Now, do I wish that he would make it to where I didn't have to be swooped in and saved every single time, Yeah, I would like to not have that kind of, weight on me at times. But I have to understand that no matter what I'm going through, he's going to get me there. And so I can, without faith, without reserve, say in faith that God will complete what he's called me to do. And so that's just something to just think about. Is this a time in your life when you need to possibly return to some memorials and remember what God has already accomplished in you to further you on? I'm probably not the only one who could say right now that God has saved me through a couple of near-death experiences where I wouldn't be here. Do what? Oh, no, that was still number 2, sorry. Yeah, that was talking about the memorials that we set up. So number 3, what is a time God literally, and I'm not talking about salvation as much as I'm just talking about saved you. Like you were headed out, you were headed, the wrong direction or whatever, and God swooped in and saved the day. And I want you to be specific as you possibly can in your response, because this is going to be another one of those times when it's going to be like, wow. Like right now, I know without a doubt, God saved me, because October 2010, I was headed to work one day, and we lived on kind of a country road in Texas, but there was quite a bit of traffic every now and then, but not as early in the morning as I was going. It was still dark, and I looked both ways, saw no headlights or nothing like that. I pulled out onto the road. As soon as I pulled out, I immediately got hit by a big old truck, and I had a very small car. And my head bashed into the window. Becky says that I was awake the whole time, but I don't remember anything until we actually got into I was in the hospital the emergency room bed. And that's the first thing I really fully remember. But that shit ended me, you know. In fact, I actually walked out of the hospital that same day and went and got my stuff out of the car. And the guy was just like his jaw had dropped, the junkyard guy, you know. And so that's all a testimony to God, right? That he literally saved me, you know. I almost feel like, you know, swoop in and save the day. So like I said, be specific in this. I want you to be specific, a specific instance. Not that God has just kept you, but give me a specific instance that has happened with. I don't want to jump too far, so. Is everybody kind of, oh, is everybody kind of good? Okay. So number 4, what is a memorial that you can set up? And this is part of this question, and you don't have to write this down, but I want you to be grand. Okay? Be grand. In other words, I don't want this to be a small memorial. If you'll notice all throughout the Bible, it wasn't like lace and pebbles on the ground. Throw a breadcrumb, right? It was these giant monumental things, you know, that people could notice and see what God had done. So what's a memorial that you can set up for yourself regarding those moments or those instances? For me, I literally keep the picture of my wreck on my phone. Although I was trying to find it today and I had a problem because I recently uploaded 4 albums for other people, and so mine got stuck somewhere in the middle. So, but it's on there. I just need to bring it back to the top again. But yeah, so for me, I literally have the picture of the wreck. Me being wheeled out on a stretcher, everything. And so, no, for you. This is a memorial for you, correct? I mean, hold on. I want to say this. It doesn't have to be just for you, but it needs to be specific to you. And like I said, don't make it something little. Make it something big. Okay. Oh, you're saying you... Okay, so you're saying you have a memorial set up on your phone. Okay, awesome. Awesome. And so Pastor Brian was saying that he literally has one of those memorial type moments set up on his phone that when a prophecy was given to him, he literally immediately wrote it down because he wanted to be sure and hold on to that because that was important to him. And so, like I said, it can be whatever you want it to be. And then question number 5, and this is kind of in response to Bill's question in a way, is the memorial just for you, or does it build about legacy? Because like we said, we noticed that in what was going on here, in fact, Pastor Brian had mentioned it, that he said that, guess what? The younger people who didn't like get to see or experience the wholeness of everything that was happening, yes. Oh, is the memorial just for you? Or does it, forget how I said it. Or, I said, is it just for you, or does it include legacy? Sorry. I have it written differently here, so when I said it, it didn't sound right. But yeah, he was talking about the children of Israel had to walk back through these memorials, but also it was a way for, once again, for this younger generation to see what had occurred and give them the faith to continue on, right? And hopefully, sometimes, and so, Bill, when you had asked that question, that's why I was kind of stumbling, because I was like, you're jumping ahead of my question, but that truly is what it's about. Because, like I said, as parents especially, don't we always want our kids to have better than we had? Don't we always want them to learn from our mistakes and not make the same ones? Let them make their own stupid mistakes. Not the same ones that we made. That would just be repeating history over and over again. And so, like I said, we need to keep this important, okay? These 5 questions, these responses that you wrote down are very important. Why? Because once again, if we fail to remember the times God saved us, then we might be sent back to the memorials of the times he redeemed us, but never get to experience the promises. And that's a check to your soul. That's a check to my soul. I don't ever want to be at that point in life. And so, and this whole Joshua series and the whole children of Israel thing has been really powerful for me. And so Pastor Brian was saying that a lot of times, even though memorials may be set up for us at first, that a lot of times it builds on and legacy-wise. Because, like, for instance, when the church originally started, where it was, they never imagined that we'd be here, and then that we'd have the new land out there. We'd have, all these people listening to our services around the nation, around the world. And so even though it was originally for them and what they were doing, it just continued to build from there. And we can see the faith steps that move from place to place, right? And so, yeah, that's true. So even if you don't set up originally for legacy, it could be for legacy anyway. Great. Giving him some sermon titles. I can't repeat that. Sorry, that was too good. But it was good. He was talking about the fact that God is all about legacy. And he's a God of the living, so even when we pass away, that God continues on with his promises. Awesome. So Linda was saying that our lives can sometimes be a memorial. And we see some of our grandparents or our parents or different people who have, she was mentioning her grandmother had prayed for her. And she wanted that same prayer life and the Holy Spirit and that kind of thing to be passed on to even her grandkids and stuff, and just keep on going from there. Because it's that sweet. So, like I said, just take this to heart. I know it's ministered to me. In fact, the whole series has been ministering to me. But it's interesting how just certain things have kind of stood out, and I couldn't help but share this because I never want to miss out on I never want to be one of those who could miss out on God's promises for us. Because God has some big things in store for us. If you ain't dead, he ain't done. I'm just saying that right now. He's got something major in play for you. He's got bigger things, better things than he's ever had before. You just got to stay faithful and remember that he's true to his promises. Yes. Yeah. I like that. So he got another sermon title. Stand up does not mean just standing still, but it's the fact that God has called us to move forward, and if we're not moving forward, we're going to be falling behind. In fact, saying that, my dad one time said, he said, for the past 5 years, and we were at a church in Rockport, Texas. It wasn't very big at that time. It was just kind of maintaining. And he said, we have spent the last 5 years going forward and then coming back and picking up somebody. Going forward, picking up somebody. Going forward, picking up somebody. Well, the problem is if we keep doing that, we're never going to make progress. And so he said, we as a people have to continue on. And if you're not ready to go with us, I understand, but we have to go on. And so it was very important because at that point it made a trajectory for our church, and it just soared after that, But it was based on the fact that, like he said, it's that forward momentum. I mean, we can kind of come back for the stragglers a little bit, but if we keep coming back, we're never going to make it to where God has us to go. So, God bless you, and thank you for being with us tonight. Come back again next Wednesday when you'll hear from Pastor Brian.